The ceaseless roar of Chicago O'Hare is a symphony of chaos. The screech of conveyor belts, the robotic PA announcements, and the impatient shuffling of thousands. It is a place that never sleeps. But on this rainy Tuesday, that deafening rhythm was about to be cut short by a silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Officer John Mitchell adjusted his duty belt, watching the carousel spin. Beside him was Rex, a 70-pound German shepherd with a nose that had seized millions in contraband. Rex was a precision instrument, calm, collected, and silent. He never broke protocol. Then the gray suitcase appeared. Rex didn't sit. He didn't whine. He launched. With a primal snarl, the dog scrambled onto the moving metal slats, sinking his teeth into the hardshell luggage. The passenger lunged, John screamed for order, and the plastic shell cracked with a sickening pop. Travelers gasped, bracing for an explosion. They were wrong. What scrambled out of that suitcase made the entire terminal go deathly, terrifyingly still. If you think a bomb is the worst thing that can happen at an airport, you haven't seen what was crawling toward the crowd. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Morning sunlight slanted through the massive glass panes of Terminal 5, casting long, clinical shadows across the polished floors. For John Mitchell, this was the beginning of the end, just 14 days until retirement. He looked down at Rex, whose ears flicked toward a distant boarding call. "Almost there, boy," John murmured. "Just a few more laps, then it's steak in a backyard for you." Rex huffed, his tail giving a single, disciplined thump. They moved toward baggage claim 4, a sea of weary faces and rolling Toomey bags. To the travelers, Rex was a fluffy deterrent. To John, he was a partner who had never once missed a cent. The carousel buzzed, and the first bags began to tumble through the rubber flaps. Rex's head snapped up. It wasn't his usual work mode posture. His hackles rose, a jagged line of fur standing stiff from neck to tail. "Rex," John whispered, feeling a sudden chill. A nondescript gray suitcase rolled closer. It looked like every other bag on the belt, but Rex reacted as if it were a living predator. He didn't give the passive alert. He didn't sit. He bypassed every rule he'd learned in a decade of service. Before John could even tighten his grip on the lead, 70 pounds of muscle hit the moving metal. Rex wasn't just alerting, he was attacking. As his teeth crunched into the plastic, a man in a high-end suit screamed, "Get that beast off my bag." But Rex wasn't listening. He was fighting the suitcase like it was a monster trying to escape. John pulled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew Rex. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a glitch. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort to stop something that shouldn't be here. And as the suitcase lid began to buckle under the pressure of the dog's jaws, John realized with a jolt of horror, the dog wasn't trying to find what was inside, he was trying to keep it from getting out. In law enforcement, noise is your constant companion. You grow used to the rhythmic thrum of the city, the static crackle of the radio, and the sharp, jagged edges of human panic. Panic is loud. It's a physical thing that vibrates in your teeth. But as I stood on the cold linoleum of Terminal 5, I realized that the most dangerous moment of my 30-year career wasn't a gunshot or a siren. It was the moment the world went quiet. "Rex, leave it. Heel." My own voice sounded alien to me, a desperate bark lost in the cavernous baggage hall. I was shouting, my hand white-knuckled on the leather lead, but it was like trying to restrain a hurricane. Beside me, four of my fellow officers, men I'd shared coffee and close calls with for years, stood like statues. Their faces were masks of pure, unadulterated shock. I could see Ramirez out of the corner of my eye, his jaw dropped, his hands hovering uselessly near his belt. They were waiting for me to lead, but for the first time in a decade, I had lost control of my partner. Rex, a dog who had once stood motionless while a suspect fired a .38 into the air, had completely snapped. He hadn't just alerted, he had launched. 70 pounds of German Shepherd were now a blur of fur and fury atop the moving baggage carousel. The metal slats groaned under his weight as he scrambled for footing, his claws screeching against the steel like fingernails on a chalkboard. He wasn't sniffing. He wasn't circling. He had his jaws clamped onto the corner of a slate-gray hardshell suitcase with a violence that made my stomach turn. He was shaking it, his neck muscles roping with tension, a low, guttural snarl vibrating deep in his chest, a sound more primal than anything I'd ever heard from a domestic animal. "Officer, control your dog. That's Italian leather. You're destroying private property." The owner of the bag, a man whose tailored suit cost more than my first house, was hysterical. He stepped toward the belt, his face a frantic shade of crimson, his hands trembling as he reached for the suitcase. It was an instinctive move, a man trying to save his luggage, but Rex's eyes, usually warm and intelligent, were wide and rimmed with white. He snapped his head toward the man, a warning growl so fierce the traveler recoiled as if he'd been struck. "Back off!" I yelled at the man, my hand instinctively dropping to the grip of my taser. "Stay away from the belt." Everything felt like it was moving through chest-deep water. I could see the other travelers now, a wide circle of people with their phones held high, filming the spectacle. They weren't screaming yet. They were confused. They were waiting for the old guard, for Veteran Officer John Mitchell, to pull his dog back and apologize for the glitch in the system. But I saw something they didn't. I saw the way Rex was biting. He wasn't trying to open the bag. He was trying to crush it. His teeth were sinking into the reinforced plastic, and I saw a thin smear of blood on his muzzle where the sharp edges had sliced his gums. He didn't care. He was acting with a level of raw, desperate urgency that bypassed every command, every treat, and every hour of training we had ever endured together. In that split second, I looked at the gray suitcase. It was ordinary. It was boring. It was the kind of bag you'd see 1,000 times a day. But as Rex's jaws tightened, I heard it. Not a tick-tock. Not the hiss of a fuse. It was a faint, muffled crunch. The structural integrity of the hardshell case was failing. The plastic was spider webbing, turning white under the pressure. The man in the suit saw it too, and his face suddenly drained of all color. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a gallows. He took one step back, then another, his eyes darting toward the exit. "Rex, stop." I lunged forward, grabbing the dog's harness to try and heave him off the moving belt before he destroyed the evidence, or himself. But Rex wouldn't budge. He planted his paws and pulled back with everything he had, his eyes locked on mine with a look that felt like a plea. He was trying to tell me something that the manuals hadn't covered. He was overriding me because he knew that my retirement papers didn't matter, my pension didn't matter, and the rules of the FA didn't matter. Then came the sound that ended the world's noise. A sharp, explosive crack echoed through the terminal as the suitcase's main latch snapped upward. The lid didn't just fall open. It groaned, the pressure from inside pushing it apart as the vials began to shift. The carousel didn't stop, but the heart of every person in that terminal did. As the first thin, translucent leg hooked over the edge of the cracked plastic, I realized that Rex hadn't been hunting for drugs or bombs. He had been trying to hold back a flood. The man in the suit turned to run, but he didn't get 5 feet before he saw what was already skittering across the floor toward his expensive leather shoes, and the realization of what was truly inside that luggage made my blood turn to ice, because the suitcase wasn't just leaking cargo, it was exhaling death. I reached for my radio, my fingers fumbling, but as I looked down at the sheer number of glass fragments now glittering on the moving belt, I realized a terrifying truth. We were in a sealed room, and the primary exit was already covered in a carpet of moving, stinging shadows. The fluorescent lights of the K9 break room hummed with a low-frequency buzz that usually set my nerves on edge, but today it felt like a lullaby. I sat on the edge of a sagging vinyl sofa, the scent of industrial cleaner and kibble hanging heavy in the air. Across from me, Rex was sprawled out on his cooling mat, his chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cadence. He was a 70-pound engine of muscle and instinct, currently idling. To the public, he was a weapon. To me, he was the only creature on this planet who truly knew the weight of the badge I wore. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the envelope. It was slightly crumpled at the corners, the official seal of the Port Authority looking more tired than prestigious. Inside were my retirement papers. January 28th, that was the finish line. 2 weeks. I ran my thumb over the date, feeling a strange mix of relief and a hollow, gnawing dread. 30 years of patrolling these concourses, of smelling jet fuel and floor wax, was coming to an end. 2 weeks, buddy, I whispered. Rex's left ear twitched at the sound of my voice, but he didn't open his eyes. Just 14 more shifts. Then we're trading the concrete for that half-acre in Gurnee. No more sirens. No more TSA lines. Just a porch and a tennis ball. Rex let out a long, huffing sigh, his tail giving a single lazy thump against the mat. He was 10 years old, a veteran in dog years, and his muzzle was peppered with gray fur that matched my own sideburns. We were both relics of an older guard, a pair of tired guardians who had seen the airport evolve from a place of wonder into a fortress of anxiety. I stood up and walked over to the lockers, catching my reflection in the dented metal. My uniform was pressed, my brass was polished, but the man underneath looked like he was made of dry parchment. I reached for my duty belt, the familiar weight of the Glock 17, the cuffs, and the radio clicking into place like pieces of a puzzle. "Work time," I said, my voice shifting into the firm, melodic tone that signaled the transition from companion to commander. Rex was on his feet before the words fully left my mouth. The transformation was instantaneous. The sleepy, domestic dog vanished, replaced by a precision-engineered detection animal. He stood at my left heel, his gaze fixed forward, his ears sharp and swiveling like radar dishes. This was the discipline we had spent thousands of hours perfecting. Our communication was a silent language of body shifts and subtle cues. In our world there was a sacred binary code. It was the foundation of everything we did. If Rex caught the chemical signature of narcotics, the sharp, acidic tang of cocaine or the earthy rot of heroin, he would sit. A firm, rooted sit that told me exactly where the poison was hidden. If he caught the scent of explosives, the metallic bite of C4 or the volatile whisper of TDP, he would lay down. A submissive, belly-to-the-floor freeze designed to prevent any sudden movement from triggering a catastrophe. Sit for drugs. Lay down for death. It was a simple system, one that had saved lives and kept the gears of O'Hare turning. As we stepped out of the break room and into the bustling artery of Terminal 5, I felt a swell of pride. Rex trotted beside me with a silver metal gait, his nose working the air currents with clinical efficiency. We passed a group of flight attendants who smiled at him, and a toddler who pointed with sticky fingers. Rex didn't lose focus. He was the gold standard, the dog the rookies studied when they wanted to see how it was done. The morning air in the terminal was damp from the October rain, carrying the smell of wet wool and expensive lattes. I checked my watch. We were headed for the international arrivals, baggage claim 4. It was supposed to be a routine sweep, a victory lap, for a man who had already cleared his locker. "Stay sharp," I murmured, more to myself than to him. "Let's keep the record clean. No mistakes, no drama. Just a smooth exit." Rex glanced up at me, his amber eyes reflecting the bright terminal lights. For a fleeting second, I saw something in his expression that gave me pause, a flicker of intensity that went beyond his usual work ethic. He sniffed the air, not toward the floor but toward the ventilation ducts, his nostrils flaring with a sudden violent twitch. He didn't sit. He didn't lay down. Instead, he let out a sound I had never heard in 10 years of partnership. A low, vibrating whine that sounded less like a signal and more like a premonition. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the damp weather or a stray scent from the food court. I didn't know then that the binary code we lived by, the sit and the lay down, was about to be rendered obsolete by a threat the trainers had never even imagined. I led him toward the carousel, unaware that my clean record was about to be stained by something far more permanent than ink. As we rounded the corner toward the spinning metal slats of the baggage belt, Rex's pace didn't just quicken. He began to pull against the lead, his eyes fixed on a single nondescript gray suitcase emerging from the rubber flaps. I felt the leather strap burn against my palm, and for the first time in my career, I realized I wasn't the one in control, and whatever Rex had smelled, it was making him break every rule I had ever taught him. Baggage Claim 4 was a cavern of sensory violence. It was the kind of place that could give a healthy man a migraine in under 5 minutes. The air was a stagnant soup of jet fuel, damp raincoats, and the frantic pheromones of 500 people desperate to be anywhere else. Overhead, the PA system rattled off a staccato list of gate changes in a voice that sounded like it was being fed through a meat grinder. Underneath it all was the relentless rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the conveyor belt, a giant mechanical tongue licking the edge of the terminal. I felt Rex's shoulder press against my thigh, his body vibrating with a tension that was starting to make the hair on my arms stand up. Usually, the chaos of a crowded carousel was just white noise to him. He was a professional. He could find a single gram of heroin in a landfill if he had to. But today, the white noise was failing to drown out whatever was beginning to scream at his senses. Standing at the edge of the dead zone, the yellow-painted line no one is supposed to cross but everyone ignores, was a man who looked like he'd been plucked straight from a luxury lifestyle magazine. He was in his late 30s, wearing a charcoal suit that draped over his frame with the kind of precision only thousands of dollars can buy. He didn't look tired, and he didn't look like he'd just spent 10 hours in a pressurized cabin. He looked annoyed. He kept checking a heavy, gold-rimmed watch, his wrist snapping up every 30 seconds with a theatrical flourish. His foot tapped a frantic, arrogant rhythm against the linoleum. While the families around him were haggling over strollers and the elderly couples were clutching their canes, this man stood in a pocket of space that he seemed to believe he owned by divine right. He wasn't looking for a bag, he was judging the world for taking so long to deliver it to him. "See that one?" I murmured to Rex, nodding toward the man. "That's the kind of guy who calls the chief if his latte is 2 degrees too cold. Let's give him a wide berth." Rex didn't even look at the man. His focus was locked on the rubber flaps where the luggage emerged. His nose was working overtime, his nostrils flaring so wide I could see the pink of the membranes. Every time a suitcase thudded onto the belt, Rex would lurch forward an inch, his ears pinned back in a way that signaled something far more dangerous than interest. The smuggler, because that's what my gut was starting to call him, retirement or not, suddenly stiffened. He stopped tapping his foot. He didn't look at the dog, but his hand went instinctively to his silk tie, straightening it with a jerky, nervous motion. His eyes were fixed on a specific spot on the belt, and for a fleeting second, the arrogance on his face slipped, revealing a jagged edge of pure, crystalline fear. "Easy, Rex," I said, my hand tightening on the lead. I could feel the heat radiating off the dog's body. The carousel groaned as a heavy, slate-gray hardshell suitcase tumbled through the flaps. It was nondescript, the kind of luggage bought in bulk, designed to blend into the background of 1,000 airports. But as it hit the metal slats, the man in the suit took a sharp, jagged breath. He didn't move toward it. He waited for it to come to him, his fingers twitching at his sides. But the suitcase never made it to his hand. Rex didn't wait for a command. He didn't wait for the bag to pass. He didn't sit, and he certainly didn't lay down. He let out a roar, not a bark but a terrifying guttural sound of pure animal desperation, and surged forward with enough force to nearly rip the lead from my glove. He wasn't looking for drugs. He wasn't looking for a bomb. He was looking at that gray suitcase like it was a predator that was about to strike, and his reaction was so violent that the passengers around us didn't just move, they scattered like leaves in a gale. As Rex's paws hit the moving metal of the belt, the man in the suit finally broke his silence. His voice wasn't the smooth, cultured tone I expected. It was a high-pitched, panicked shriek that cut through the terminal noise like a razor blade. "Get that dog away from there," he screamed, lunging toward Rex with his hands clawed. "You don't know what you're doing. If you break that seal, God help us all." I reached for my taser, my mind racing to catch up with the chaos, but as I looked at the man's face, I realized he wasn't worried about his Italian leather. He was looking at the suitcase with the expression of a man who knew he was carrying a trigger, and that my dog was about to pull it. The air around baggage claim 4 had thickened, turning into a heavy, invisible fog that only Rex seemed able to pierce. We were patrolling the perimeter of the carousel, moving in the synchronized rhythm that had become second nature over a decade. Usually this was the part of the shift where Rex went into a flow state, a calm, methodical sweep where his nose acted as a high-resolution scanner. But as we drew closer to the gray suitcase, the rhythm didn't just break, it shattered. I felt the shift through the leather lead before I saw it. It started as a micro-tremor in Rex's shoulders, a sudden hardening of the muscle that felt like a coiled spring reaching its limit. Then came the physical transformation. His ears, usually alert and swiveling, pinned back flat against his skull, smoothing his profile into something streamlined and predatory. His tail dropped, not in fear, but in a rigid, low-slung tuck that signaled a high-threat engagement. "Rex, easy," I muttered, my voice low and steady. I used my correction tone, the one that usually snapped him back to his training. "Search. Stay on task, boy." He didn't even acknowledge me. His nose wasn't hovering over the bags anymore. It was thrust forward, tracking a scent trail in the air that seemed to be vibrating with its own malevolent energy. A low growl began to bubble up from his throat, a sound so deep and resonant it felt like it was coming from the floorboards beneath us. It wasn't the "I found something" bark. It was the "I am facing a monster" warning. The gray suitcase was 10 feet away, clicking rhythmically against the metal slats as it drifted toward the man in the charcoal suit. The man's eyes were darting between Rex and the luggage, his posture stiffening into a defensive crouch. He looked like he wanted to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot by a terror he couldn't hide. "Heel, Rex," I commanded, my voice sharper now. I gave a firm, authoritative tug on the lead. In 10 years, Rex had never refused a direct command. He was the most decorated K9 in the district because his discipline was unbreakable. But today the rules of the academy were dead. Rex didn't heel. He didn't even flinch at the correction. Instead, he planted his paws, his claws skidding briefly on the polished tile, and resisted me with the full weight of his 70-pound frame. I looked down at him, stunned. "Rex," I said, "heel." He turned his head just enough for me to see his eyes. They weren't the eyes of my partner anymore. They were wide, the pupils blown out until the amber iris was just a thin, panicked ring. He looked at me with a desperate, heartbreaking intensity, his muzzle wrinkling as he inhaled a scent that seemed to be burning his very senses. He wasn't being defiant, he was being protective. He was ignoring me because my commands were a secondary concern to the literal life and death threat he was smelling. The scent hit me then, not the chemical bite of explosives or the organic rot of drugs. It was something primal, something that triggered an ancient alarm in the back of my own lizard brain. It smelled like dry earth, bitter musk, and something sharply medicinal, like a hospital room that hadn't been cleaned in years. It was the smell of something that didn't belong in a crowded terminal. It was the smell of a hidden, silent venom. Rex's growl escalated into a sharp, piercing whine. He lunged forward, not toward the man but toward the bag, his body straining against the harness until I thought the stitching would snap. The passengers nearby finally caught the change in the atmosphere. The chatter died. The phones came out. The air in the room felt like it had been electrified. "Officer, your dog is out of control," the smuggler yelled, his voice cracking with a high-pitched desperation. "Pull him back. He's going to attack." I opened my mouth to defend my partner, to say that Rex never attacked without cause, but the words died in my throat. Rex wasn't waiting for an explanation. He realized I wasn't going to let go of the lead, and he realized the suitcase was getting closer to the crowd. In one explosive motion, he didn't just pull, he launched his entire body upward, aiming straight for the moving belt. But it wasn't the attack itself that froze my heart. It was what happened the second his teeth made contact with the suitcase's zipper. A faint, high-pitched skittering sound echoed from inside the bag, a frantic scratching of hundreds of tiny legs against plastic that suggested the suitcase wasn't just full of contraband, it was alive. The gray suitcase reached the apex of the curve, its wheels clicking with agonizing regularity as it glided toward the man in the charcoal suit. For a heartbeat, the terminal seemed to hold its breath. The world narrowed down to the movement of that bag and the rising, jagged energy radiating from the dog at my side. I felt the leather lead vibrate in my hand, a live wire hum that told me the tether was about to snap. Not just the physical strap, but the decade of discipline that held us together. "Rex, stay," I whispered, a final, futile attempt to tether him to the rules of the old guard. But Rex was done with the rules. The scent coming off that bag was no longer a hint, it was a scream. As the suitcase drifted past us, Rex's muscles coiled and released with the power of a hydraulic piston. He didn't bark. He didn't warn. He snapped. With a frantic, explosive lurch, he ripped the lead from my unsuspecting grip and launched his entire 70-pound frame into the air. He hit the moving metal slats of the carousel with a deafening clang, his claws scrambling for purchase on the slick surface. The crowd didn't just gasp, they erupted. A woman shrieked, clutching her child to her chest as they stumbled backward, creating a chaotic ripple effect through the baggage hall. To the onlookers, this wasn't a police procedure, it was a mauling. It was the nightmare of a mad dog, come to life in the middle of O'Hare. Rex didn't care about the optics. He didn't care about the cameras. He scrambled over a red duffel bag, his eyes locked on the gray target with a terrifying, singular focus. He reached the suitcase and sank his teeth into the reinforced plastic corner with a violent, bone-deep snap. His head thrashed from side to side, a predatory kill shake designed to rip and tear. The sound of his teeth grinding against the hard shell sent a shiver down my spine that I can still feel today. "Get that animal off my property," the smuggler roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of fury and absolute, unmasked terror. He lunged toward the belt, his hands clawing at the air. "Do you hear me? That's Italian leather. That bag is worth more than your life, you idiot. Get him off." He wasn't acting like a man worried about his luggage anymore. He was acting like a man trying to stop a fuse from reaching a powder keg. He reached out to grab Rex's collar, his face a mask of sweating, desperate rage. "Back away from the dog," I shouted, finally breaking through my own paralysis. I moved toward the belt, my boots heavy on the linoleum, but the scene was dissolving into a blur of motion. The other officers, Ramirez, Carter, and the rest, were rushing in now, their boots thumping a frantic rhythm against the floor. They were shouting, their hands hovering over their holsters, their eyes darting between the dog, the bag, and the screaming owner. They didn't know if they were supposed to assist me or arrest the dog. They were looking at me for the old guard signal, for the calm veteran to take charge, but I was just as lost as they were. Rex's growl had reached a pitch I didn't know a dog could sustain. It was a raw, vocalized agony. He was biting harder, his gums beginning to bleed against the sharp edges of the bag's zipper. He was fighting the suitcase as if it were a living thing, and as he shook it, the sound from within changed. The muffled scratching was gone. In its place was a new sound, the distinct, crystalline tinkle of breaking glass. The smuggler heard it too. He froze mid-lunge, his arm outstretched, his face suddenly turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. He didn't scream about the leather anymore. He didn't scream about his rights. He took a single shaky step backward, his eyes fixed on the widening crack in the suitcase's shell where Rex's teeth had finally found purchase. A thick, yellowish liquid began to seep from the puncture marks, dripping onto the gray metal slats of the moving belt. Rex didn't let go, but his entire body began to tremble with a violent, rhythmic shudder. He knew what was coming. He had tried to crush it, but the pressure of his own jaws had just accelerated the catastrophe. As the suitcase lid gave a final, sickening pop, a low hiss filled the space where the screams had been, and I realized that the Italian leather wasn't just a container, it was a pressurized chamber that had just been breached. The terminal had become a pressure cooker, and the smuggler was the first to boil over. As Rex continued his frantic assault on the suitcase, the man in the charcoal suit abandoned his high society mask entirely. His face contorted into something jagged and ugly. With a snarl that mirrored the dog's, he lunged forward, his polished designer shoe swinging in a vicious, arcing kick aimed squarely at Rex's ribs. "I said get him off," the man shrieked, his voice breaking into a jagged falsetto. My training, 30 years of protocol, de-escalation, and by-the-book restraint, simply evaporated. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was a physical reflex. Before his foot could connect with my partner's flank, I surged forward. I didn't reach for my cuffs or my radio. I slammed my shoulder into the man's chest with the force of a freight train, the impact jarring my teeth. The smuggler flew backward, his heels catching on the edge of a stray duffel bag. He hit the floor hard, skidding across the polished linoleum, but the arrogance hadn't left him yet. He scrambled to a seated position, gasping for air, pointing a trembling finger at me while his other hand clutched his bruised chest. "You're dead, Mitchell. You and that mongrel. I have friends in the consulate. I'll have your badge and your pension for this." Behind me, the sound of heavy boots echoed like a drumline. Ramirez and Carter arrived first, their faces pale under the flickering fluorescent lights. They were the men in the background of the chaos, the ones caught in the crossfire of a situation that didn't fit any training manual they'd ever read. They stood in a half circle, their hands hovering over their sidearms, their eyes darting with a frantic, rhythmic intensity between the thrashing dog on the moving belt and the screaming man on the floor. "John, what the hell are we doing?" Ramirez yelled over the din. His hand was on his holster, his knuckles white. "He's attacking a civilian's property. The chief is going to crucify us." "Look at the dog," I roared back, not taking my eyes off the smuggler. "Look at him, Ramirez. Does that look like a mistake to you?" The officers hesitated, caught in a paralyzing limbo of indecision. To any outsider, it looked like a veteran officer had finally lost his mind, letting his K9 go rogue on an innocent traveler. I could see the internal battle in their eyes, the terrifying question of whether they should draw their weapons on Rex to stop the unprovoked aggression, or tackle the man who was now trying to scramble back toward the suitcase with a look of manic desperation. Rex's claws were screaming against the metal slats of the carousel as it continued its mindless, circular journey. He had his paws braced against the side of the suitcase, his head buried deep into the puncture he'd made. He was whimpering now, a high-pitched, agonizing sound that tore through my heart. He wasn't biting out of anger. He was biting out of a sheer, terrifying necessity to keep the bag closed. "Is it a bomb, John?" Carter shouted, stepping closer, his hand reaching for my shoulder. "If it's a bomb, why aren't we evacuating? Why isn't he laying down?" "It's not a bomb," I whispered, the realization finally settling in my gut like lead. "It's something worse. Something that doesn't care about our protocols." The smuggler saw the officer's hesitation and tried to seize the moment. He scrambled to his feet, lunging toward the carousel one last time, his hand reaching for the handle of the gray suitcase. "It's mine. Give it to me." But as his fingers touched the handle, the suitcase gave a final, shuddering lurch. The crack Rex had started didn't just widen, it split. A sound like dry parchment tearing filled the silence that followed, and a tiny, pale yellow shape, no bigger than a man's thumb, flicked out from the breach and landed directly on the smuggler's hand. The man froze. His scream didn't come out as a sound, but as a silent, wide-mouthed gasp of pure, soul-deep horror. As I watched the translucent, segmented tail of the creature arch over its back, I realized that the suitcase wasn't just a container for venomous life, it was a ticking clock of biological warfare, and the first second had just run out. The air in Terminal 5 felt like it had been sucked through a vacuum, leaving behind a thin, metallic-tasting void. The carousel continued its indifferent, mechanical rotation, carrying Rex and the doomed suitcase toward the center of the crowd. I stood frozen between the duty I had sworn to uphold and the animal who had never once steered me wrong. My fellow officers were shouting, a wall of noise that meant nothing, as Rex's focus reached a fever pitch. He wasn't just holding on anymore, he was destroying. His rear paws found purchase on the vibrating metal slats, and he arched his back, putting every ounce of his 70 pounds into a final, devastating pull. Then came the sound. It wasn't the loud bang of a firearm or the boom of an explosive. It was a sequence of small, sickening failures. First, the metallic ping of the heavy-duty zipper teeth shearing off their tracks, flying like shrapnel against the metal belt. Then, the rhythmic crunch of the reinforced plastic shell finally surrendering to the pressure of Rex's carnassial teeth. The suitcase didn't just open, it disintegrated from the inside out. I turned my gaze to the smuggler, expecting another outburst of litigious fury, another threat against my badge. But the man who had been screaming about Italian leather just seconds ago had vanished. In his place was a hollowed-out shell of a human being. The smuggler's face didn't just go pale, it turned a translucent, waxy gray. His eyes, once sharp with arrogance, were now wide and glassy, fixed on the jagged hole Rex was tearing into the luggage. His hands, which had been reaching out to strike my dog, were now clamped over his own mouth, as if he were trying to keep his soul from escaping. He knew. He wasn't afraid of the police, and he wasn't afraid of the damage to his property. He was staring at the suitcase with the abject, soul-crushing terror of a man looking into his own open grave. "Don't," the man whispered. It was so quiet I barely heard it over the drone of the belt. "Please don't let it open." But it was too late for please. Rex gave one final, violent shake of his head. The internal structural supports of the bag snapped with a sound like a dry branch breaking in a winter forest. The seam of the suitcase didn't just gap, it yawned wide. I saw Rex's eyes widen, his pupils shrinking to pinpricks as he caught a face full of whatever was pressurized inside. He didn't back away. Even as his gums bled and his muscles screamed with exhaustion, he tried to shove his nose back into the breach, attempting to seal the hole with his own body. He was whimpering now, a high, thin sound of pure, unadulterated dread. Inside the dark cavity of the luggage I saw movement. Not the shifting of clothes or the slide of hardware. It was a roiling liquid shadow. A dozen glass vials, shattered by the force of Rex's jaw, glittered like diamonds amidst a swarm of pale, translucent shapes that were already beginning to pour over the jagged plastic edges. The smuggler took a stumbling step back, his heel catching on the yellow line, his breath coming in short, jagged hitching sobs. He looked at me and for a split second I saw a flash of pity in his eyes. Pity for me, for the dog, and for every soul trapped in this terminal. He knew the biological math. He knew exactly how many seconds we had left before the silence of the airport was replaced by something much, much worse. As the first wave of the swarm hit the gray metal of the carousel, the light from the terminal windows caught the curved, stinger-tipped tails rising in unison, and I realized that the silence wasn't just a lack of noise, it was the world holding its breath before the first scream. The suitcase didn't just fail, it exhaled. When the final seam gave way under the relentless pressure of Rex's jaws, the interior of the bag seemed to boil over. It started with a cascade of glass, dozens of thin medical-grade vials that had been packed into foam inserts now shredded by the dog's teeth. They rolled out onto the moving metal slats of the carousel, clicking and chiming like morbid wind chimes before hitting the steel and shattering into 1,000 glittering diamonds. And then came the inhabitants. They didn't crawl so much as they spilled, a roiling, pale yellow tide of segmented bodies and arched, needle-tipped tails. Hundreds of them. They were translucent, almost ghostly under the harsh terminal LED lights, their color the sickly hue of old parchment or desert sand. Deathstalker scorpions. Even from 5 feet away I could see the twitching of their pedipalps, the delicate, spindly pincers, and the menacing curve of the metasoma, the tail that housed a neurotoxin capable of shutting down a human respiratory system in a matter of minutes. The effect on the terminal was instantaneous and unnatural. In law enforcement, you are trained for the screamers and the runners. You expect the panicked surge of a crowd trying to escape a visible threat. But as the first wave of scorpions scuttled off the gray suitcase and began to spread across the moving metal belt, the screaming simply stopped. It was as if a giant hand had been clapped over the mouth of every man, woman, and child in baggage claim 4. The silence was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of abject terror. 500 people stood frozen, their breath hitching in their throats, their eyes wide and fixed on the floor. No one moved. No one dared to even shift their weight. There was a collective, instinctual realization that any sudden vibration, any frantic step, would draw the attention of the hundreds of pale shadows now radiating outward from the carousel. The only sound left was the mindless, mechanical clack-clack-clack of the conveyor belt, which was now serving as a distribution system for the venomous swarm. As the belt moved, it carried the scorpions past the feet of the travelers, dropping them off like lethal luggage into the gaps of the linoleum. Rex had stopped biting. He stood on the belt, his paws braced between the moving slats, his head low. He was huffing, his breath coming in short, jagged bursts, his eyes tracking a dozen different movements at once. He looked like a king of a ruined castle, surrounded by a moat of crawling death. He had done his job, he had intercepted the bag. But in the process of stopping the smuggler, the biological bomb had been detonated. I looked at the floor near my boots. A single death stalker, its tail high and quivering, was inching toward the shadow of my shadow. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple, but I didn't wipe it away. I couldn't. To move was to invite the sting. To speak was to break the fragile spell of the silence. We were all trapped in a deadly game of statues, waiting for the first person to crack, while the smuggler, the man who had brought this plague into our house, began to back away with a slow, ghostly gait that suggested he knew exactly how little time we had before the first person fell. But as my gaze shifted from the floor back to the suitcase, I saw something even more terrifying than the scorpions. A second, smaller compartment inside the ruined bag had been crushed by Rex's weight, and a thick, dark vapor was beginning to hiss out from a canister that hadn't been broken, yet. The silence of the terminal was finally broken, not by a scream, but by the rhythmic, heavy thud of boots and the hiss of oxygen tanks. From the far ends of the concourse, the cavalry arrived, not in blue uniforms but in ghost-white Tyvek suits. The hazmat teams moved with a clinical, detached speed, their faces obscured behind the glass visors of their respirators. They looked like astronauts walking through a nightmare, wielding specialized vacuums and long-handled containment tongs that clacked rhythmically as they plucked the pale yellow shadows from the floor. "Don't move. Keep your hands where we can see them." The command didn't come from me. It came from a tactical team that had moved in behind the hazmat crew. They weren't looking at the scorpions, they were looking at the man in the charcoal suit. The smuggler didn't fight. The arrogance had been drained out of him, replaced by a hollow, shuddering tremor. As the steel cuffs ratcheted shut around his wrists, he looked down at the ruined suitcase on the belt, his Italian leather, now a biological crime scene. He was being led away not just for trafficking, but for a reckless endangerment charge that would likely see him spend the rest of his life behind bars. I didn't watch him go. My world had narrowed down to the 70-pound animal still standing on the stationary carousel. "Rex," I whispered, my voice cracked and raw. "Down, boy. It's over." Rex didn't lay down for explosives this time. He simply stepped off the belt, his claws clicking softly on the tile as he approached me. He looked exhausted. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the risk of a stray scorpion, and pulled his head into my chest. My hands moved over his fur, checking for the telltale swelling of a sting. I found none, but as I lifted his muzzle, my heart ached. His gums were raw and bleeding, the jagged plastic of the hardshell case having sliced into the soft tissue as he fought to hold the bag closed. "Good boy," I choked out, wiping the blood from his fur with my sleeve. "You did it, Rex. You saved them." Shadows fell over us, and I looked up to see Chief Miller standing there. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in a heavy protective coat, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the chaos of the baggage claim. He looked at the retirement papers sticking out of my pocket, then at the dog whose mouth was stained with the evidence of his unprovoked aggression. "The brass is already calling for a report on the property damage," Miller said, his voice low. "They saw the footage of you shoving a diplomat. They wanted to talk about internal affairs, about protocol violations, about euthanizing a dog that bites a civilian's luggage." I started to stand, my hand tightening on Rex's harness, ready to fight one last battle. But Miller held up a hand, a small, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Then the hazmat lead identified the species," the chief continued. "Lyrus conquestriatus. Deathstalkers. If that bag had reached the carousel crowd and burst naturally, we'd be counting bodies, not vials. You didn't just break protocol, John. You and this dog stopped a massacre." He reached out, his gloved hand patting my shoulder. "Take the envelope out of your pocket, Mitchell. You can keep the badge if you want it, stay another year, be the hero of the department. I looked down at Rex. My partner looked back at me, his tail giving a single, weary wag. The fire of the hunt was gone, replaced by the quiet dignity of a dog who knew he had finished his watch. "No, sir," I said, finally feeling the weight of 30 years lift off my shoulders. "I think we're done." "I figured you'd say that," Miller nodded. He looked at Rex, then back at me. "The city's taking the smuggler's assets. That means the department doesn't need to retire the K9 assets to the kennel. Take the dog home, John. He hasn't just earned the backyard, he's earned the man who goes with it." As we walked toward the exit, the morning sun finally broke through the Chicago clouds, flooding the terminal with a light that didn't feel clinical or cold. It felt like home. I felt the weight of the lead in my hand, no longer a tether of control but a bond of friendship. "Steak tonight, partner," I whispered. Rex didn't whine and he didn't growl. He just leaned his weight against my leg as we passed through the glass doors and into the fresh, rain-washed air, leaving the noise of the airport behind for the very last time. Officer John Mitchell spent 30 years protecting people who never even knew his name, and Rex? He bled to make sure a suitcase full of death never reached that crowd. They both gave everything to keep that terminal silent so the rest of us could keep making noise. Don't let their final watch go unrecognized. If you think Rex is more than just a tool, if you believe a partner like that deserves a peaceful retirement instead of a cold kennel, then hit that like button right now to salute his bravery. And if you're the kind of person who stands by those who protect us, subscribe and join our community. We don't let stories of true loyalty fade into the background. I want to hear from you. If you were John, would you have trusted your gut and let your dog break protocol, even if it meant losing your pension? Drop a "good boy" in the comments if you think Rex is the ultimate hero. Let's show the world that we haven't forgotten what real loyalty looks like.